Hey there, jabronis. On today's episode of the Byword, Dave and I will be chronicling our favorite aspects of the Attitude Era of pro wrestling and getting to the bottom line of what made these years stand out. So listen up, brother, because this episode is too sweet. Welcome into another amazing episode of the Nerd Byword podcast. Today, the Brothers of Destruction, Dave and myself, will be talking about our favorite aspects of the Attitude Era of professional wrestling. We promise that Dave was not maimed in a house fire, and I am not actually, in fact, the dead man. However, I do look sweet in all black, and you should see Dave on a rampage when the kids aren't turning in their schoolwork. The idea for this episode has been stewing for quite some time, ever since our interview last year with comedian Mike Lawrence, and I found out mid-interview on air that Dave was also a massive fan of pro wrestling from this time period. But first, there's been a torrent of nerd news, so we've got to get you covered there. Dave, what's your story for the week?
Yeah, so the big news coming out of DC Comics this week is that the regular monthly Superman title is set to be replaced with a new title, Superman, Son of Kal-El. The book will focus on teenage Jonathan Kent, the son of Lois and Clark, who takes over his father's duties protecting Earth. The book is set to be written by Tom Taylor, with art by John Timms. Now, as a huge Superman fan, I'm incredibly torn about this news. On the one hand, it's Tom Taylor, whose current Nightwing is already one of my all-time favorite takes on the character. John Timms' art on Young Justice, among many other projects, was also fantastic, so the creative team on this book is top-notch. On the other hand, there's the Bendis of it all. I mean, look, I love the rebirth era of Superman. It was so spot on and a lot of fun. And one of the things that made this run so good is the family dynamic that was established between Clark Kent, Lois Lane, and their preteen son, Jonathan. If ever there was a superhero made to be a dad, it's Superman. And the book just worked. It was incredible, really. And then Brian Michael Bendis jumped ship from Marvel to DC, and well, his run on Superman mostly left me cold. One of the biggest problems to me was that he aged up Jonathan Kent and shipped him off to the future to have adventures with the Legion of Superheroes. And that move essentially destroyed what was still a fairly new dynamic in the Superman books that still held countless story possibilities. Jonathan's characterization as a teenager has also been pretty bland overall, especially compared to his characterization as a preteen. His interactions with Damian Wayne alone as Robin, so good and so much fun. So on the one hand, I trust Tom Taylor and John Timms. And on the other hand, I wish they'd just de-age Jonathan Kent and returned to sort of a rebirth era feel for the Superman books. They are working so hard to try something different when they haven't even fully explored a status quo that actually worked. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm completely out in left field in the woods here when it comes to DC continuity and all of that. I'm leaning on your expertise. But on the other hand, I'm a massive Tom Taylor fan, and everything that I've read from him is absolute, not even gold, it's platinum. It's perfection for me. His X-Men Red is one of my all-time favorite X books, and I've read quite a few. So it's just amazing what he can do in these like short runs. I also love his Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, and it's a great maxi series, and some of the best Peter Parker content that we've gotten in years. So I love how he understands his characters. His all-new Wolverine is on my to-read list very, very soon. And I'm also excited to, I picked up the first issue, but I haven't read it yet, of his Batman Detective story. So I'm super excited to see that. And I'm just glad that he's getting more work than these mini and maxi series. I know he jumps back and forth between the big two on different titles. So he's kind of got a foot in each pool. but I'm glad to see that he's going to be on a regular book. So as far as the roster of Superman comics, I'm coming at this as a very, very casual observer, but I'm excited to see Tom get some extended work here.
Yeah, and I can agree with that. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm a big fan already of his Nightwing, and we're only 2 issues in. He really has a knack for getting sort of to the core of the characters he's working with, and sort of representing those characters in their purest, this sort of distilled form. And so, I'm interested to see what he does with Jonathan. I just really hope he manages to recapture some of that exuberance and joy that the character had as a preteen before he was sort of blanded out.
Yeah, well, in that regard, I will give him like all the credit in the world, because the work that he did specifically with X-Men Red, Jean Grey has been kind of ups and downs for me in terms of like the quality of the writing of that character, and he did a lot to really give her like a good characterization and a compelling and interesting storyline, alongside some of the supporting characters in that book that I had little to no experience with, and some that he introduced for the first time that I instantly fell in love with. So here's hoping.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Chris, you're taking us back to the MCU. Marvel, man, what you got?
So I cheated a little bit. I've been a bit of a renegade the last couple of weeks, coloring outside the lines. But there have been so many exciting news nuggets coming out this week for the MCU that it didn't feel right to just pick one and then we not talk about the others. So here's some quick hits. So I'm gonna go, super speed here. Khaleesi herself, Emilia Clarke, has been cast in the upcoming Disney Plus series Secret Invasion in an unannounced role. Some of the internet speculation include the roles of Queen Varanki of the Skrulls, who was the architect of the Skrull invasion in the comics, so that's probably a strong one. Abigail Brand, the one I'm hoping for, the bad green-haired director of Sword. And even Spider-Woman. I saw a Screen Rant article speculating a Spider-Woman. My personal hope is for Brand, as Sword has already been introduced into the MCU via WandaVision. And she would also be a direct link into bringing mutants into the MCU, as she is herself a mutant and half alien. So you got like the cosmic part of it, and then you're also streamlining mutants. So that's my hope. But if I have to bet, if I had to go to Vegas on this, I would think Queen Varanki would make the most sense story-wise, especially with an actress of her gravitas and the acting chops that Emilia Clarke has. Number 2 on our quick hit list, Russell Crowe confirmed in an interview that he will be playing Zeus, king of the Greek pantheon, in the film that I'm looking most forward to, Thor: Love and Thunder, setting the internet ablaze with Hercules speculations. Now, for those of you that don't know from the comics counterpart, Hercules has been like this friendly rivalry with Thor. They're very much, very similar in their respective pantheons of the gods. So they always have these friendly competitions of arm wrestling or whatever. So I'm excited to see Hercules, speculatively introduced into the MCU. Now, I am excited about this news. This movie is starting to get quite crowded. You've got the Guardians, which I'm thinking, and fingers crossed, are just going to be like at the very beginning, a very, very short time. You've also got Jane coming back, and that's a huge storyline that needs to breathe. And then you're throwing in, Zeus into this. So I'm hoping it's just not overstuffed and everything gets their respective area to breathe. Thirdly, fans got their first teaser trailer for Shang Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, and boy, it did not disappoint. The fights look to be incredibly choreographed, well done, and the storyline surrounding Shang Chi and his father is truly compelling. In fact, it sent me down a deep martial arts flick rabbit hole. I watched Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Mortal Kombat kind of scratched that itch. We'll talk more about that soon. Needless to say, I'm super stoked for this one. And finally, the latest breaking news from Marvel is that there will be indeed a 4th Captain America film following the events of the finale of Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Now, I'm trying my best to avoid spoilers here, but I was very glad to see this news, as a lot of meandering plot lines were begging for further storytelling at the end of the 6th and final episode. So I'm super excited to see where all these characters go from here. Dave, your thoughts on all of this I'm hitting you with?
All right, I'm going to try to do the quick hit list. Let's go ahead and start with Shang-Chi. I'm pretty darn enthusiastic about this trailer. I really, really love martial arts movies. I don't think I've made a secret out of the fact that I'm big into Asian cinema to begin with. My love of kaiju is just one aspect of that. And so seeing the MCU take on this genre and kind of put their own spin on it, I think has the potential to be incredibly interesting and a new flavor again for the MCU. And we've talked about the notion that much of the MCU feels a little samey. So anytime that they step outside of that and try something new is ultimately a good thing. More flavors is what we need in the MCU. Obviously, I'm not super familiar with Shang-Chi as a character. I've seen him pop up here and there as a guest in other series, but I've not really read any of his solo materials, so I'm eager to learn more. The Emilia Clarke and Russell Crowe thing. Look, I trust Taika Waititi, first of all. If he thinks Russell Crowe's the right guy to play Zeus, I'm here for it. I've just kind of soured on Crowe's performances over the last few years. His turn in Les Mis was questionable. And although his take on Jor-El in Man of Steel wasn't bad necessarily, his Robin Hood was... Oof. I mean, look, I don't think I ever loved Russell Crowe more than I did in Gladiator, and that's been a hot second. And I don't know if he's just not been picking great roles, great directors, or if I've missed some of his best stuff in recent years and it kind of flew under the radar. I really hope he's fantastic in Thor. I really, really adore vintage Russell Crowe, sort of, around the Gladiator time. He was absolutely fantastic in that movie. Emilia Clarke, to me, really is similar. She's clearly a capable actress, but outside of her performance in Game of Thrones, I don't think I've ever seen her in anything I truly enjoyed. Terminator Genesis was not exactly a good movie, and I don't think Clarke was very well cast as Sarah Connor. Now that I think about it, my favorite performance of hers was probably in Solo, a Star Wars story, but that was not that meaty of a role, basically. So again, I think she's capable. I hope she does fantastic work for the MCU, but it's been a hot second since I've seen her in something I really enjoyed. I'm a little worried, actually, with this casting news, because I think as the MCU progresses and is making more and more money, these billion-dollar movies, that they're focusing more and more on casting household names, safe bets, name recognition people. When Robert Downey Jr. was cast as Iron Man, he was considered a risk. Chris Evans was, fairly well known, but not exactly A-list when he was cast as Captain America. And I really, kind of enjoyed that risky casting. And I hope that the MCU continues to put performance over name recognition and take some risks. Which brings me to your last news item, which actually has me very excited. Again, trying to avoid spoilers, but I think from everything that we know about Captain America 4, this is kind of a little bit out of the comfort zone of the MCU. And I think it's the right move. And I'm really, really looking forward to Captain America 4. It, in the grand pencil pusher scheme, that movie sounds like a bit of a risk, especially spinning out of what is essentially a TV show. But you know what? It shouldn't be. And I'm glad that they're doing this. I'm probably, out of all of these things, most psyched for Captain America 4. And I really, really, really want to see what they're going to do with that, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. I echo a lot of your sentiments. The reason that I'm super excited about it is the chemistry between Sebastian Stan and Anthony Mackie is just top notch. I know that we were kind of hesitant about it with the first trailer that we saw. It didn't really kind of showcase that, but I think it is by far the strongest overarching thing of this entire series, and hopefully we get to dive more into that in the film. This whole bromance slash antagonistic relationship where they can't stand each other, but they're best buddies. I really have loved watching their relationship kind of blossom over these 6 episodes, and I can't wait to see it on the big screen. All right, that wraps up our nerd news segment for the week. When we come back from this, our first break, we're going to be getting some attitude adjustments. Stick around. All right, welcome back for today's Byword Big Talk segment. We are diving head over heels into the Attitude Era of professional wrestling. Now, for those of you who may be not too familiar with it, here's some context about what would we mean when we say the Attitude Era. And this is a direct entry from the Wikipedia article. The Attitude Era was a term used by World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE, then known as World Wrestling Federation or WWF, to describe the company's programming during the Monday Night Wars, a period in which WWF's Monday Night Raw went head to head with World Championship Wrestling's WCW's Monday Nitro in a battle for the Nielsen ratings each week during the late 90s and the early 2000s. WWF's programming, branded as, quote, WWF Attitude, end quote, from 1997 to 2002, featured adult-oriented content, which included an increase in the level of depicted violence, profanity, and sexual content. This era was part of a wider surge in the popularity of professional wrestling in the US and Canada as television ratings and pay-per-view buy rates for WWF and its rival promotions saw record highs. So we're talking late 90s, early 2000s, professional wrestling. Pro wrestling has probably not seen like a bigger surge in popularity than it was at that point. And then, we're around about the same age. So these were formative years of our middle, high school, and college years to where we were growing up with this and, really piqued our interest. So this was, really in our wheelhouse. So we each had to narrow it down to our three favorite things. Is where we're getting a little bit nostalgic this week. Three favorite things from this era of wrestling. Dave, what is your first favorite thing about Attitude Era wrestling?
Yeah, so I'm not going to lie. You kind of entered your three choices first, and a couple of those would have been on my list as well. So I decided to draw a little outside of the lines and not talk about necessarily, favorite wrestlers or anything like that, but kind of trends that were going on during this time. And the very first thing that I think I need to talk about is simply the announcing, particularly the announcing at WWE, then WWF. The announcing team of Jim Ross and Jerry the King Lawler was something special. I cannot for the life of me picture the Attitude Era without the voices of Jim Ross and Jerry the King Lawler on commentary. To me, they are not just the voices of the Attitude Era, but probably the finest announcing team in pro wrestling, period. The chemistry between the two was basically pure gold. JR may be the best commentator ever. He was always knowledgeable in terms of history and the business. He also took this really decent, honest approach to commentary. He was, in a lot of ways, the audience surrogate. He rooted for the good guys, despised the bad guys, was shocked by shocking events, cheered great matches. JR was basically one of us. And this kind of made a special space for Lawler to be sort of the bad boy that sides more with the bad guys, makes inappropriate comments, and then, JR has to kind of rebuff him. And even though they basically rooted for different kinds of wrestlers, their commentary never was confrontational. It really felt more like a mild disagreement between two close friends. Their banter was so much fun to listen to. Even when the matches were maybe not as entertaining as you'd hope, Ross and Lawler kept the audience entertained. JR had such a passion for wrestling. I can still hear him yelling, "Stone Cold, Stone Cold, Stone Cold," or announcing that an upcoming match was going to be a slobber knocker. Combined with, this quick wit and humor of Lawler, we had the very best announcing team ever. Nobody has even come close since, Kris.
Yeah, man, in a lot of respects, the King and good old JR are like the soundtrack to my childhood. I mean, I grew up, and when I was in my backyard on my trampoline, jumping around and quote unquote wrestling with my wrestling buddies, those little pillow type things that I would wrestle with, like I would hear their voices in my head, and um, it, I got a hot take. I think Jim Ross is the best play-by-play commentator in all of sports. In all of sports, I really think that it doesn't get much better than him. And it was immediately the draw for me to check out AEW, and I saw that he had crossed over from them. I thought, like, wow, that's a big get for this, young and hungry brand that's really trying to set out, for them to pull over JR, like that was a big one. And I totally echo your sentiments about the chemistry between the two of them. The good guy, one of us, good old boy, cowboy hat mentality of JR, and just like that respectable character. He's got his own barbecue sauce, for God's sake. Um, and then you have the creepy perv of Jerry the King Lawler. I'll never forget, Deborah coming out with Jeff Jarrett. He'd just be screaming puppies. Like, I'm like, oh my God, he's such a creep. And like, we look back on it like 20 years later and just like, oh, it's a bit uncomfortable, but like, I think with JR, to like kind of cut him down right there, I think it worked. So would you do this differently if you had this team in 2021? Maybe, probably, but I think it's not as cringy as it could have been without JR to kind of balance the scales there. So, and I just love the dynamic. Like you said, it's a disagreement between friends, and like I just love hearing it. I love, one of my favorite things about being on Twitter is the 90s WWE account, and they like will take like viral videos, and they'll just put JR and the King's voices over it, and it's just perfectly timed, because I mean, like, it doesn't get much better than these two.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard for me even now to turn on, WWE product and just kind of check it out to see what's going on, and noticing that, hey, there is no Jim Ross, there is no Jerry the King Lawler, and I'm like, these guys are not bad, but something just feels off. By far one of my favorite things about the Attitude Era.
And even back in the day when SmackDown kind of branched off from Raw, and they had Michael Cole and Taz, and now Michael Cole is like their big one now that JR has left. But like having Michael Cole and Taz on SmackDown, I was like, what is this great value JR and the King? Like, you still had them trying to do those same roles where Taz was the antagonistic announcer and Michael Cole was the root for the good guys one. And like I always look at Michael Cole and I think of The Rock, just clowning him when he was a backstage, interviewer, and I was like, you're not JR, get off the screen. But yeah, so it's really hard to kind of follow that up.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Kris, what is your first big favorite thing about the Attitude Era of wrestling?
Oh man, it's got to be The Rock. He's always been my favorite wrestler, even when he was Rocky Maivia, and just like, he's just so iconic. And I think the reason that the Attitude Era worked, and the reason that it launched all of this interest, is the character work. Like, okay, we're grown adults now. We know that professional wrestling was staged. Like, the wool has been removed from our eyes. So when that this is all an act, when that this is not quote unquote real, I mean, these injuries are real, these are actual trained professionals, but you know what I'm saying. How do you get people to buy in? And for all intents and purposes, it is the acting chops of these people and their ability to capitalize on their personalities and their characteristics. And I think no one did that better than The Rock. Like, he has this gravitas, he has this presence. Even now, 20 years later, is he's like this A-list movie star. His social media presence, his work in the community, being on the big screen. I think he's the big dynamite personality that kind of has transcended and still remains, you know, ever present, all these years later. I mean, for God's sake, we've been waiting how long for Black Adam just because his name is attached to it? Like, it's crazy. And just the like the catchphrases, like his promos were top notch. Like, finally The Rock has come back to whatever town or city that he was in. Like, it was just always A-list content. It was always good. And just the fact that he would just always find a way to playfully dog his opponent, Like one of my favorites is when he tells, like, I think it's the when he's going at the Big Show and he just starts talking like nonsensical garbage, or he tells somebody to shut up, and like, and then you hear like the King's voice just go, "Ah!" Like it's so good. Like his promos were top notch. I mean, I idolized him from age 8 on. Like I would have a fake elbow pad that I would rip off my arm, throw it across the room, and lose it. And then, I would conduct a people's elbow on my action figures or my pillow. Like, the guys just, I mean, like when I first became a dad, I got in trouble for trying to rock bottom my kids, like as soon as they were able to walk. Like, so The Rock was my first favorite, my all time favorite, and I still follow his work to this day.
You know, I like Dwayne Johnson, the actor, just fine. He's a fun dude, makes good action movies overall, and is a charismatic performer. But I'd still trade in every single Johnson movie for one more year with The Rock. The Rock stands as one of my all-time favorite wrestling characters. Sure, there were and are wrestlers more skilled in the ring, but I'd argue that there has never been a wrestler better on a mic. This overblown, over-the-top character was everything to me during the Attitude Era. His promos, his storylines were always what I looked forward to the most. I'll never forget the Backlash pay-per-view when he finally beat Triple H for the championship. I knew it was scripted, I knew it was a performance, but I didn't care. I cheered like it was Germany winning the World Cup. The Rock was first and foremost, I think, a storyteller. His promos, his matches, every moment he was on screen or in the ring furthered a story in a compelling way. I mean, people like Kurt Angle could wrestle circles around The Rock, and yet the two were able to put on a super entertaining match and make each other look amazing. And I'd argue that The Rock's in-ring storytelling skills were second to none. But yeah, his attitude, to me, even more than Stone Cold Steve Austin, exemplified why I loved pro wrestling during the Attitude Era. His snide sarcasm, his hilarious promos, the over-the-top confidence were simply perfect. This was, and still is, my favorite wrestler of all time. And so, again, I like Dwayne Johnson just fine, but I will always adore The Rock, Chris.
I think for me, I think it's that, like, it's that personality. Like, you kind of latch on to fictional characters that have something, some joie de vivre that, like, you're wanting, you wish you had yourself. So like I was like this kid who didn't have a lot of self-confidence, who didn't have a lot of self-esteem, and I was kind of, I self-doubted a lot. And then to see this person like have so much overflowing with confidence and cockiness and attitude, pun intended, like it was aspirational for me. Like, yeah, I am awesome. Yeah, that's me. So I love also, and I think my overarching thing, like I said before, is to why this was so awesome. This was can't miss TV. This was appointment television at its finest. You had to be there Monday night, switching back and forth between Nitro and Raw. You didn't want to miss a single minute of it. Was because of the character work. And like one of my favorite things about The Rock was the Rock and Sock connection. Like you had these two improbable teammates of Mick Foley's Mankind with Mr. Socko. Why in the world would he ever be a tag team partner with like Mr. Fancy $1,000 shoes, The Rock, with his like Gucci shirts and Versace pants? Like, why would they ever be a team? But it works so much, and the comedy between the two of them, it was just perfection.
Yeah, I cannot add anything to that, man. I wholeheartedly agree. I love Mick Foley anyways, and he was almost on the list of, best things about the Attitude Era. But I think Foley in a lot of ways transcended the Attitude Era. He was there, before, in various promotions, and was doing a fantastic job, and he stuck around long after and continued to do a fantastic job in various other roles. So, but yeah, I totally agree.
All right, so speaking of tag teams, that's kind of leading us into your second point, Dave.
Yeah, tag teams are such an interesting part of the pro wrestling scene, and I still feel that they were never served better than during the Attitude Era. I feel like the tag teams today are often treated as a stepping stone to a greater solo success. And sometimes that works. I mean, it worked for several people. But more often than not, leaning into the team dynamic leads to much better results. And the best example of this is probably the Attitude Era. The three tag teams that will forevermore stand out to me were the Hardys, the Dudleys, and Edge and Christian. The feuds among those three tag teams were epic. There was so much talent present in those three teams. You know, Jeff Hardy's willingness to leap off of pretty much anything made the Hardy Boys matches inevitably a spectacle. The Dudleys and their gimmick of putting people through tables, whether that won them the match or not, was great in-ring storytelling. And you never knew when Bubba would snap and tell Devon to go get the table. Then there's Edge and Christian, who were the perfect team of arrogance and skill. Their gimmick, of course, was using steel chairs for a, I kid you not, concerto. I'll never forget the first ever tables, ladders, and chair match. Oh my, SummerSlam 2000. What a match, man. What a match. You can put that sucker on today and it still holds up. Then they followed it up with a sequel the following year at WrestleMania 17, and both matches were showstoppers, no show stealers. It wasn't just that they were a lot of high-risk moments, the in-ring storytelling was just fantastic too. And you know, I occasionally tune into Raw today just to see what the product is like now, and it inevitably leads a little bit to disappointment. And one of those disappointments is that the tag team division has just kind of disintegrated. There was a time when tag matches could be the best matches on the card. And that was, of course, the Attitude Era. And the fact that they don't lean into tag teams anymore the way they used to. They don't push that sort of tag action, pushing teams the way they used to. I think that is a huge mistake of the modern WWE.
Yeah, absolutely. And it got to the point where like another one that almost made my list was the amazing video games that we got during this time period. I mean the SmackDown games 1 and 2, I mean, it was so much fun. WCW versus the World was one of my favorites as well. You got to go international, like it doesn't get much better than that. But it was so much so, like, it was so, these characters were so inseparable that, like, if you were to play, like, a 1v, like, a singles match with, like, one of those characters, it just didn't feel right. Like, if you were to play with just Bubba Dudley, it was just like, well, where's D-Ray? Like, or Devon, excuse me. Or if you were to play with Jeff Hardy, we're like, well, where's Matt? Like, this doesn't seem right. I was a huge fan of the Brood. That also one of the things, like, we could go on forever. One of the things that, like, really just caught my attention, we know how much I love music, how nerdy I am about it. For God's sake, our first episode had, like, however many music clips. Like, the entire idea of having, like, entrance music, like, that's like the overarching thing for me as a fan of professional wrestling that I was, is how cool would it be if you were to walk into a boardroom or walk into a faculty meeting or walk into, whatever, like your classroom, and you have entrance music. Like, how cool is that? And the another aspect of these tag teams is they had, like, these incomparable, like, magnetic entrance themes, and, like, their entrance as a whole, the way they would come out, the way they would interact with the crowd, the way they would pose, was just so awesome. The way the Brood would just rise up from the floor was so awesome. Like, I mentioned to you personally that I was watching WrestleMania, and, like, a lot of it kind of fell flat because it was, like you said, it was just like solo versus solo, 1v1, and it was like, where's the camaraderie, where's the brotherhood or sisterhood of, like, a tag team match? And that was something that I really clung to, was, like, depending on someone else, and, like, these friendships and these teams, kind of forged by adversity, that I really think is lacking now.
Yeah, I can agree with that. All right, Kris, what is your second big favorite of the Attitude Era?
Oh man, it's the New World Order, NWO, specifically the Wolfpack. Like, this is how impactful it was. I played recreational YMCA basketball, and I convinced my teammates to name the team the Wolfpack. Like, that's how big I was on it. And I made them choose black and red colors. So like NWO, specifically the Wolfpack, like I said, with The Rock, where you're kind of like seeing things in other personalities and other characters that you wish you could be yourself, and just that kind of. I was a really goody two shoes kid growing up. I always like was afraid to get in trouble, but like just this like whole like Rage Against the Machine type mentality of the NWO, specifically the Wolfpack. They were a revolution against the revolution, the Wolfpack. So led by Kevin Nash and less Scott Hall. I didn't really like Scott Hall, but Scott Snyder. When I saw Sting in red and black face paint, those were like my two favorite colors as a kid. Like, it was just incredible. Buff Bagwell, and my personal favorite, my favorite WCW wrestler of all time was Conan. Like, you had some big names, some legendary names that that wrestled for decades, but Conan was my favorite. I grew up, as it's my career to be a Spanish teacher. I grew up fascinated by Latinx culture, and to see this Puerto Rican Cuban guy kind of just lean into that culture, it was just captivating to me. He had the cool flannel shirt that was only buttoned at the top. He had the cool hat, the leather gloves, the baggy jeans. Like, Conan was super cool. And like I said, just like this whole like against the world type mentality of being yourself and being a revolutionary and kind of pushing back against the establishment. And I mean, like, it gave us one of the most iconic signatures of the Wolfpack, and Too Sweet. Like, so the NWO, specifically the Wolfpack, was one of my all-time faves.
I got nothing, Chris. I never watched WCW. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I tried a couple of times, and I simply loved WWE's product so much better back then. The little exposure I got to the NWO was when Nash, Hall, and Hogan came to WWE in 2002. And the whole thing left me pretty cold. I don't think the WWE did a really good job utilizing the NWO once they arrived. The best thing by far we got out of it were some truly excellent matches between Hogan and The Rock. Well, maybe not from a technical standpoint, but as I mentioned earlier, from an in-ring storytelling perspective. I mean, Hogan was getting a little long in the tooth already at that point, but those matches were a lot of fun. And as far as the NWO and the WWE, did nothing for me. I prefer D-Generation X, and I know that might be a weird thing to say as somebody who never watched that much WCW, but I enjoyed D-Generation X back then a lot more.
Oh, I could totally understand that. Like, it was a whole movement, and I probably did that gesture that is associated with D-Generation X probably one too many times on the playground. So I've got love for DX too, especially the bad Billy Gunn. Love me some bad.
Yeah, Billy was really awesome, and I know they tried to solo push him a couple of times, and it just never quite worked out, which I thought was sad. I think he was a really good performer.
Well, the entire, and Road Dogg Jesse James, how could I forget? Like, that whole like speech montage. As fans of this show know, I am all about like a thespian, like dramatic performance. I love acting. I almost went into it. I just wanted to make money and have a stable career, in college. So I did not choose theater, but it's like one of the things that I love through and through. But like, I used to have it memorized, but I don't anymore. The Road Dogg Jesse James, the bad Billy Gunn. It doesn't get better than that, man.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't.
All right. Dave, what is your final thing that you loved about the Attitude Era of pro wrestling?
This is going to sound obvious, but I think I need to expound on it a little bit. It was risky, and it was not family friendly. The best thing about the Attitude Era is right there in the name, and that's attitude. This was never family friendly stuff. The gimmicks of wrestlers, the over-the-top storytelling, the general edgy vibe of, waving middle fingers and taking on the establishment resonated with audiences in a way the modern WWE simply doesn't. The Attitude Era was born really out of necessity. The WWE had to fight competing against WCW, fighting for every viewer, and the only way they could win was to go big, be bold, and lean into the bat poop crazy storytelling. And there was so much bat poop crazy storytelling. There was a hardcore championship that had to be defended 24/7 in no disqualification matches. Random matches starting in all sorts of locations. Title holders were walking around paranoid at all times that somebody would attack them. It was absolutely priceless entertainment. This is a time when the undercard was insane. Val Venus's gimmick was that he was a former porn star. The Godfather came to the ring accompanied by his hose because, yes, he was a pimp. Al Snow was running around with a mannequin head that he talked to, for crying out loud. It was bonkers. It was over the top. It was always unexpected. And because of that, it was a crap ton of fun. You know, the thing that sticks with me the most about the Attitude Era compared to today is the long-form storytelling. Storylines could take months, sometimes over a year, to completely resolve. There were twists and turns. Feuds had a chance to breathe, to escalate. Ultimately, that meant that we got some fantastic matches and storytelling. Today, everything seems to resolve within about 4 weeks, just in time for the pay-per-view that month, and then the cycle begins again with new feuds rather than, improving on and escalating existing stories. Today's WWE is just so bland by comparison. It's kid friendly, but it also feels, dumbed down, I guess is the way to put it. So many other companies, like, for example, Pixar, have found ways to make family friendly content that appeals to all ages. WWE has not figured that out yet. Most of their faces right now are so boring. The heels are the ones who get all the fun stuff to do. There's really not a chance for faces to shine, I think. And the storylines are too short and low stakes. I will say this. The best thing by far about the modern WWE to me is that women are finally being taken seriously as competitors rather than, quote unquote, eye candy for male viewers. If I could take the modern women's division and transplant it to the Attitude Era, that would be fantastic. But yeah, I simply miss a time when the WWE would take risks. Beer drinking, middle finger waving Stone Cold would never have a chance to develop that character today. The Rock and the stuff he said? No way! Triple H running around and hitting people with a sledgehammer? Forget about it. Chris, I fear we will never again see a wrestler like Mae Young give birth to a hand ever again. So I miss that edginess, Chris. I just miss the unexpected, bonkers storytelling.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I will say that I enjoyed large aspects of WrestleMania, the most recent one. And it was particularly surrounded around the match between Bianca Belair and my current favorite female wrestler, Sasha Banks. So, and I totally agree with you. If we could take that and they weren't just puppies and eye candy, and it was just like, let's see how skimpy we can get, and which is a trope of the '90s. I mean, like, look at Image Comics, like that was one of their biggest calling cards was boob windows. So I totally agree. If we could take that, or vice versa, take the mentality of really leaning into the character work of the Attitude Era and transplanting that today, whichever one, I think that would be a perfect marriage. And I totally agree, because I will never forget, like, sneaking way past my bedtime and finishing Monday Night Raw, and you get like some surprise attack, and then you see like the victim of said attack just staring disbelievingly as the credits roll, and you're like, no, I need more. Like, and they would always like run into the next show that was supposed to be on. Like, so we're like, okay, you're already interrupting the next show. Can I just please get more of this content? And then having to wait a week. Oh man, like it was just nonstop drama and action, and I think that's really what happens when you have these seminal characters and you give them room to breathe, and I think that's like the perfect recipe for success. And now I can't tell whether or not you have the same level of talent character wise or acting wise, but we wouldn't know, because like you said, it's this compressed fast food kind of thing month to month from whatever the pay-per-view is. Like, I remember feuds going multiple pay-per-views and then like a revenge match in the next pay-per-view. So yeah, give it room to breathe, man.
Yeah, yeah. It's the long form storytelling. I think even more than the general inappropriateness of some of the stuff that was happening is a real hallmark of the Attitude Era that is sorely missed today. All right, Chris, what have you got for your final big like of the Attitude Era of wrestling?
So we kind of hinted at it with the long form storytelling, and this is probably one of the ones that I stole from you by jumping in the dock first. But it's got to be the Stone Cold Steve Austin and Vince McMahon rivalry. That was the one that like captivated for years, years. It was a back and forth. Vince McMahon firing Stone Cold only for him to show up at Raw the next week, and I mean, for God's sake, there was one particular promo that I remember so vividly is Vince McMahon laid up in a hospital bed with his foot in a cast, and then Austin, disguised as the doctor in scrubs, and then all of a sudden he takes out a bedpan and then just mercilessly beats him with a freaking bedpan, and then like probably the most iconic of this is where Vince was in the middle of the ring doing some kind of tra-la-la, like gala type presentation with a red carpet. And I'll never forget Austin diving over the top ropes. And it's partially because of JR saying Austin got McMahon over and over again. And like, he's just pummeling. So the back and forth, like I said, it just went on for years. And it was one of those things that like, as the credits rolled Monday night, you're like, damn it, I need more of this. So the Austin McMahon rivalry was probably, I don't know if we saved best for last, but like probably the one thing that came out of this era as the most resonating thing when like you look back on it 20 plus years later. Like if you had to pinpoint one thing, it's Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Vince McMahon. And this is just leaning into those characters that they have built and giving them room to breathe and just flex their muscles, pun intended, and like just do what they do best. I mean, into where you've created this persona now where Stone Cold Steve Austin has his own talk show after Raw. He's got his own beer, for crying out loud, that I'm dying to try if I can get it shipped here. But yeah, Austin McMahon.
One of my friends at the time was a huge Stone Cold fan, and I could certainly see the appeal. I enjoyed him a great deal as well. The foul mouth, the middle fingers, the beer drinking. Austin was the poster child of the Attitude Era in a lot of ways, and although I personally preferred The Rock. The thing that made Austin work, and I think why his heel turns never really did work, is that his character worked best when he was going up against authority. The audience was basically living vicariously through him. I mean, who didn't want to give their boss a stunner and flip them off? The Austin McMahon rivalry was absolutely fantastic, filled with, memorable moments, twists and turns, and constant over-the-top action. Here's another example of a rivalry, just as you mentioned, that got a chance to breathe, that could take a long time to unfold, to escalate, had twists and turns. It was just really fun, interesting storytelling. So although I was never as big a fan of Austin as I was of The Rock's, this rivalry is definitely among the best, if not the best, that the WWE has ever produced. I do want to, though, give an honorable mention to another feud that that Stone Cold Steve Austin was in that I don't think gets enough credit. A lot of people talk about his feud with McMahon, his feuds with The Rock, his feud with Triple H. But to me, one of the most fun Austin feuds was actually the feud between him and Booker T. I don't think I ever had as much fun or laughed as hard as when on a particular episode of Raw, Booker T decided to leave because he was tired of Austin chasing him. And no matter where he went throughout the rest of the 2-hour episode, Austin would show up and try to pummel him in memorable places like a supermarket, or my personal favorite, in a confessional, where Steve Austin was actually acting like he was the priest and then jumped through and tried to beat the snot out of Booker T. A fantastic feud that I don't think gets enough credit from this time period. But yeah, I mean, Austin McMahon was absolutely tops.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's, probably part of it is recognizing who's who could be a better villain in this era than Vince McMahon himself? He's like a real life villain. I mean, like with the way that wrestlers have been treated in, in their retirement ages and not having benefits. So that, I mean, it's perfect, villainy. But now he's up there in age, and you can't really trot him out like you used to be able to back in the day. But I love Booker T. I have mad love for Booker T. Like it makes me happy to think about that. I just bought an action figure of Booker T for my son the other day, so like that always makes me happy to see some Booker T.
I do feel like we've only really scratched the surface about the things that were awesome about the Attitude Era. We didn't even get a chance really to talk much about stuff like, Undertaker and Kane and their feud and then their team ups. Paul Bearer as one of the absolute best managers. There's so much stuff that was going on in the Attitude Era that was absolutely fantastic. Like I mentioned earlier, even sort of the mid-tier, not necessarily main event wrestling. There was so much good stuff going on, so many interesting characters. It was just never boring. The one thing you could never accuse, especially the WWE of during this time period, was that it was boring.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, it's this is how timeless that storytelling is. My 9-year-old son, all he does in his free time, he doesn't play Fortnite anymore. He's obsessed with Kane and the Undertaker. So he watches YouTube videos nonstop 24/7. I'm not exaggerating. It's literally like it's time to do schoolwork now. He's watching, wrestling matches from 1999 of Kane and the Undertaker. And for myself personally, it is the very first storyline that I remember watching, like the whole house fire of Kane, being maimed, and then like the whole idea of Kane like unmasking was just revolutionary. Like no, and like the whole voice box thing, just incredible. And that was probably some of the best storytelling, and I can't believe we didn't even get into that, even though we're getting into it now. But it's just nuts. So like how awesome nonstop action. I mean, like Godfather and the Ho Train, like what? Oh man, it's so good. It's so good. And kind of doing the prep for this episode, really brought back some fond memories, like having an entire backpack filled with action figures to the brim, wrestling in my trampoline, accidentally launching neighbor kids off of said trampoline because I got a little too vigorous. But yeah, it's just a fond trip down memory lane, this whole episode, man.
Yeah, I agree, and it made me incredibly nostalgic, and it really made me miss the days when I could, just seriously enjoy the WWE's product and just Raw was must see television. I had to watch Raw every single week. It was the absolute best show, most entertaining show. Just 2 hours and usually 2 hours and 10 minutes or 2 hours and 5 minutes of just pure joy. And I do miss that. I miss it a great deal.
It's the one way that my little goody two shoes self kind of pushed back against authority, and I would sneak up past bedtime just to watch it. So it was the best thing on television by far. I remember when the Rock and Sock Connection first joined, and I called my friend, and he said, "Dude, my mom is in sleep. She has to get up at 3:00 in the morning for work. Don't call my house." And he hung up on me. But I was just so like, this is, who else do I tell this? Tell about this. We didn't have text messaging back then. Like, it was just so good, man.
Of course, no doubt, Twitter would have been like, "That's a horrible pairing. I don't know what they're thinking."
Oh man. Well, that wraps up our Byword Big Talk of the week. I mean, like, we could probably do 3 or 4 episodes on this, to be honest. We may revisit this again. Because pro wrestling, during that era for myself, and it was just so awesome. But so yeah, when we come back from our final break, we're going to hit you with 2 more nerd commendations. All right, we're back for our final segment, nerd commendation time. Dave, you got a YouTuber that you're recommending? What is going on?
Dude, I'm not gonna lie. There is a sort of a corner of YouTube that I absolutely love, and that is video game YouTubers, not streamers. I'm really not into streaming. I don't enjoy watching other people play video games. I want to play them myself. But I really like, YouTubers that, talk about video games sort of in historical context, or, put a particular entry of a series into its context and does some comparative videos between various video games. I like a little bit of historical background to go along with my video game playing. Surprise, surprise, given my background as a historian. And, I've talked in the past about video gamers and some of my video game YouTubers and some of my articles that I've published online, but I have not had a chance to talk about this one. And this one really has kind of gotten my attention lately. And that is Matthew Kowaleski, who goes by Matt McMuscles. He is a YouTuber known for his in-depth analysis of video games, and easily the best content that he puts on YouTube. And my nerd commendation for this week is a series that he calls What Happened. These videos take an in-depth look at video games and consoles that had a troubled production, are considered bad, or were canceled before release. So videos in this series usually run somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes. Sometimes they're a little shorter, sometimes they're a little longer, but that seems to be the sort of the overall sweet spot. And they are really just a sweet, sweet dose of video game history. As somebody who loves video games and history, it's really the perfect combination for me. And he also doesn't shy away from the occasional injection of humor, which of course I always appreciate. The videos are well researched, fast moving, and entertaining as heck. One of my favorite videos delves into what went wrong with the release of Nintendo's Wii U console, which was a good console hampered by public misperception, poor marketing, and a lack of games, basically. There's also a really, really great episode on Mighty Number 9, the Kickstarter, and how this spiritual successor for Mega Man basically failed miserably. McMuscles also made videos on games as diverse as Mega Man X7, Dark Souls 2, Rise of the Robots, and Castlevania 64 of all things. Now, if you were there for Castlevania 64, you know what kind of disappointment that thing was. On top of that, he will also occasionally branch out and discuss movies such as Dragon Ball Evolution and Freddy vs. Jason. So in short, when it comes to gaming YouTubers, Matt McMuscles' What Happened series has quickly become one of my favorites. There's really good stuff there, a lot of historical context, and it's just really nice to kind of delve into, what went wrong with some of these games.
So this is super interesting because I very much am of the same mindset, and if Twitch streaming or YouTube streaming is your thing, is your go-to sort of entertainment, we're by no means gatekeeping. It's just I also would much rather play the game myself. Also, as far as YouTube, like I just see so much toxicity when it comes, like anytime that I hear about YouTube, it's usually someone being hateful, someone being a comics gator, or someone trying to limit the exposure or limit diversity or something hateful. So I'm glad to see that there's something else out there when it comes to video game YouTube. My exposure to YouTube, my experience with YouTube is usually strictly limited to movie trailers that I'm excited about, or like walkthrough tutorials on levels that I'm struggling with. So that's about all I do on YouTube. But it's really interesting that you say this, because I was just listening back to last week's episode when I was making this exact point about talking about video games with you from the historical perspective. So this definitely kind of scratches that itch, and kind of being interested in video games and history at the same time. So it's super intriguing.
And I will also say there's a great YouTuber called the Video Game Historian that is even more so somebody who delves really in historical context of video games. But yeah, rule number one, Kris, if you're going to hang out and watch YouTube videos, is just to never read the comments. You can avoid about, I would say, 80% of all toxicity just by ignoring all comments on YouTube videos. All right, Kris, what are you nerd commending this week?
So, Dave, I know what you're going to say, but I'm recommending another X book.
Really?
But this one might be an interesting entryway for you. Hear me out, okay? It features a Catholic protagonist. So Way of X #1 was a debut issue this past week It's written by Cy Spurrier and with art by Bob Quinn, and it features my all-time favorite mutant, the priest himself, Father Kurt Wagner, Nightcrawler, as the main protagonist of the series. Um, if you are looking for, quote unquote, necessary prerequisite reading, I would highly recommend reading X-Men #7 of the current volume, where they discuss the Crucible and what it means to, really, how do you value death in a world where, mild spoilers, mutants in Krakoa have conquered death, so to speak, and they have resurrection protocols. So if you go on a mission and you die, they could just, build you a new husk and resurrect you lickety split. Now there's a queue and there's a long line, and sometimes you get moved up the line, but whatever. So you really don't have to worry about death. And what's really interesting and intriguing about this book is, Nightcrawler is one of the few religious, spiritual characters in the mutant world. He's an ordained priest, and he has this, very strong faith that kind of guides his path and directs, his choices. And what does that mean to live in a post-death society, so to speak? He takes issue with some of his teammates that are, a little devil may care and kind of recklessly going on a mission because they don't care about dying because they could just be resurrected. And then it gets into some really metaphysical, philosophical debates between himself and my other fave, Magneto, about, what is religion? And Magneto makes an interesting point of all the gods of these pantheons you've encountered except for the one that you claim. So it's just this really interesting dynamic, really meta context of, religion in the modern era. And, as a deeply spiritual person myself, this was a really, really interesting debate, combined with, the action that I love in an X-Men book. So Way of X #1 is really expertly written. It's got some real great humor. So high compliments to Cy Spurrier, who this is my first, introduction to his writing, and I'll definitely be checking out his other works. Art by Bob Quinn that is super, super fun. A lot of, interesting characters that I love on this. And so I know that the Krakoa era can be a tough place to kind of jump on, but, for the debates alone on this issue, I really, really enjoyed it.
Of the countless, never-ending, expansive X-Men related nerd commendations you've made this year, this one strikes me as probably the most interesting. The notion of a mutant paradise is not that interesting to me, but the notion of Nightcrawler trying to, apply his religion to this paradise and maybe finding something slightly off about it, that's much more interesting to me. I enjoy Nightcrawler a great deal as a character anyways. He's German, he's Catholic, I don't know. I relate somewhat, I don't know why. Giving him the spotlight in this book sounds like something I would gravitate towards. The notion of this Krakoan resurrection stuff raises all sorts of interesting questions anyway. And I'm kind of surprised it's taken this long to really, question those things. I mean, is the person that comes back truly the same? Is it just a duplicate? Where does the notion of a soul factor in? And seeing a book actually willing to explore some of those questions. Yeah, that's interesting to me. Of course, I would no doubt have to read a crap ton of comics just to work my way up to this book, which sounds exhausting, but I may try to just dive in and Google whatever I don't understand and just see, if Way of X is maybe my way into this whole Krakoa thing.
Yeah, so as I said, like X-Men #7, they explicitly lay out what the Crucible is, and kind of what all that entails. And you have Kurt kind of giving the precursor kind of prelude to this book with like even the idea of founding a new mutant religion based on all of these developments, and himself, what does this all mean? So X-Men #7 for sure. Probably the X-Men main title would be a one to read up on. I'm a big fan of most of the X titles. I have a few that I could take or leave, but probably the X-Men main title, specifically issue 7, is probably requisite reading for this one.
All right, well, I might give that a shot.
All right, that wraps up another attitude-infused episode of the Nerd Byword podcast. We thank you for sticking around with us, and be sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app that you use. You can also find us on nerdbyword.com.
And please don't be a stranger. You can find us on social media. Feel free to interact with us. We are on Twitter and Instagram at NerdByWord. You can also find us individually at ThatNerdChris and at ThatNerdDave. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. And those good conversations usually bring about some great ideas for future episodes.
Absolutely. And stay tuned, because we are coming up on our 1-year anniversary episode. Episode 52 will be our Nerdies episode, where we will hand out awards to our favorite items of nerd culture from the year past. And as always, stay well and stay nerdy.
The Nerd Byword is written and produced by Kris and Dave, two nerds with a love of all things pop culture. The podcast features music by Al Jimenez and show art by Ashery Design. Find us at nerdbyword.com and wherever podcasts are available.